Most people talk about EVs and immediately jump to lithium, sometimes cobalt, occasionally nickel if the discussion gets more technical. But there's a quieter material sitting in every lithium-ion battery, in larger quantities than lithium itself, that rarely enters policy debates with the same urgency: graphite. Not the pencil kind in a romantic sense, industrial graphite processed into anode material. And according to estimates from the U.S. Geological Survey, China accounts for roughly 70 to 80% of global refined graphite supply used in batteries, depending on the year and how you define processing stages. That number sounds like a mining story at first. It isn't. Because China's advantage is not simply geological, it's industrial. An EV battery isn't built around raw graphite chunks. It requires spherical graphite with purity levels often exceeding 99.95% carbon content. That transformation is not trivial. It involves high-temperature purification, chemical treatment, and tight control over particle morphology. The margins are thin, the environmental cost is high, and the capital investment is easy to underestimate until you actually try to build the facilities outside China. This is where the story quietly shifts. A country can have graphite reserves and still not matter much in the battery supply chain. Mozambique, Brazil, Madagascar all have significant deposits. But turning those deposits into battery-grade anode material is where most expansion plans slow down or get repriced into unviability. China didn't just scale mining, it scaled the uncomfortable middle. The step that removes impurities like sulfur, iron, and silicates. The step that shapes graphite into consistent spheres so it can efficiently intercalate lithium ions during charging cycles. The step that sits between geology and manufacturing and often determines who actually controls the downstream industry. And here's where the common narrative breaks slightly. We tend to treat EV supply chains as a race for raw inputs. But graphite exposes something more structural. Control often sits in processing bottlenecks, not resource ownership. The raw material is widespread enough to suggest diversification is possible. The processing layer suggests something else entirely. In China's case, this processing ecosystem didn't emerge by accident. It was built over 2 decades of industrial clustering. Chemical suppliers, furnace manufacturers, anode producers, logistics networks, all within short geographic loops that reduce cost per ton in ways that are hard to replicate elsewhere without restarting the entire system. Now step back for a second. If EV adoption accelerates globally, and even conservative projections from agencies like the International Energy Agency still assume tens of millions of new EVs annually by the end of the decade, graphite demand scales with it almost linearly. Every lithium-ion battery uses significantly more graphite by weight than lithium. That imbalance alone reshapes how critical minerals should even be defined. And yet policy attention remains elsewhere. Maybe because graphite doesn't behave like a scarce geopolitical headline. It doesn't spike in the same dramatic way oil does. It doesn't trigger visible crises until the downstream industry starts feeling constraint. By the time shortages show up, the bottleneck is already embedded in long-term contracts and refining capacity. There's also a quieter tension here. Western economies have started announcing graphite projects, but most are still years away from full-scale battery-grade output. Some will succeed, many will struggle with permitting, environmental scrutiny, and cost overruns tied to purification processes that are energy-intensive and chemically messy. So the question becomes less about whether graphite exists outside China, and more about whether the world is structurally willing to replicate the part of the supply chain that China concentrated early on. And that's where the uncertainty sits. Because if you misread this market as a mining story, you assume substitution is straightforward. If you read it as a processing monopoly, the timeline for change looks very different. I'm not fully convinced the global response is calibrated to that difference yet. Next part is where it gets more uncomfortable, because the dependency isn't just historical. It's being reinforced by today's battery design choices and industrial policy trade-offs. The interesting thing about graphite is that it doesn't behave like a critical mineral in the way governments usually model risk. Lithium gets the attention because price spikes are visible. Nickel because it sits in headline-making battery chemistries like NMC. Graphite sits underneath all of it, structurally essential, but economically quieter. That quietness is misleading. If you look at a standard lithium-ion battery today, whether it's a Tesla-style NCA cell or a BYD LFP configuration, the anode is still overwhelmingly graphite-based. Even as chemistries evolve, the industry hasn't really escaped it. Silicon is often discussed as the replacement, but in practice, it is a hybrid solution. Silicon-graphite blends that still lean heavily on graphite as the stabilizing backbone. Full substitution remains technically constrained by expansion issues during cycling. So the demand floor doesn't really move the way analysts sometimes assume. It rises with EV adoption, almost mechanically. Now, China's position becomes more interesting when you stop thinking of it as a static share of production and start looking at how the system self-reinforces. A lot of early graphite refining capacity didn't emerge in isolation. It followed downstream battery manufacturing. CATL, BYD, and a dense ecosystem of mid-tier suppliers created predictable demand signals inside China first. Once you have guaranteed buyers within trucking distance, capital expenditure risk drops sharply. That alone changes the economics of scaling. But there's a second layer that's less discussed: environmental arbitrage. Graphite purification, especially to battery-grade levels, is energy-intensive and chemically aggressive. In many Western jurisdictions, permitting for acid leaching and high-temperature treatment plants runs into multi-year delays. Not because it is impossible, but because it is politically and regulatorily expensive. In China, during the scaling phase of its EV push, that trade-off was handled differently. The environmental cost was absorbed in exchange for industrial acceleration. That divergence compounds over time. Because once refining capacity clusters in one geography, the rest of the supply chain adjusts around it. Shipping routes, contract pricing, technical standards, even particle size specifications begin to normalize around what the dominant supplier produces efficiently. It's not just production share, it's specification power. This is where graphite becomes strategically sticky. Even if another country develops raw graphite mining, it still has to plug into a processing architecture that already has global standards set elsewhere. And rebuilding that architecture isn't just about money. It's about coordination between chemical processing, equipment manufacturing, labor expertise, and consistent output quality at scale. There's a historical parallel here that's hard to ignore. Rare earths in the 1,990 seconds. The world didn't lose access to them, it lost processing diversity. And rebuilding that took decades, even with policy urgency. Now, I want to be careful here, because this doesn't mean China has an unbreakable monopoly. It doesn't. What it has is time advantage embedded into infrastructure. And time advantages are difficult to price in markets. Western responses are starting to emerge. Australia has upstream graphite projects. Canada is trying to build integrated critical mineral hubs. The U.S. Inflation Reduction Act is explicitly designed to decouple parts of the supply chain from Chinese inputs. But if you track actual battery-grade output, not announcements, the gap remains large. There's also a less comfortable dynamic forming inside EV strategy itself. As automakers push for cost reductions, especially in price-sensitive segments, they tend to favor chemistries and suppliers that are already optimized at scale. And right now, that optimization still points back toward Chinese processing ecosystems. So even diversification strategies can, paradoxically, reinforce dependency in the short term. It becomes a timing problem more than a direction problem. You can absolutely build alternative graphite supply chains. The question is whether they arrive before EV penetration locks in demand at a scale that makes switching economically irrelevant. And I'm not fully convinced the global build-out speed is aligned with that window. There's another layer we haven't touched yet, something more structural than trade or industrial policy. It's about how battery design choices themselves subtly lock in graphite demand, even in next-generation roadmaps that are supposed to be post-lithium-ion evolution. That's where this gets even more interesting. There's a habit in energy transition conversations where people assume technology progression automatically dissolves dependency. Like chemistry evolves in clean steps, old material out, new material in, supply chains reset themselves. Graphite breaks that illusion, because even the most aggressively next-generation battery roadmaps don't actually remove it in practice. They adjust how much they rely on it, not whether they rely on it. Take silicon anodes. On paper, silicon should be the replacement story. It can theoretically store far more lithium per unit mass than graphite. That sounds like a clean substitution. But silicon expands by roughly 300% during lithiation. That creates mechanical stress, cracking, rapid capacity fade. So what the industry actually does is blend it with graphite to stabilize the structure, which means the innovation often increases graphite's role as a structural support material, even when its share per cell is supposed to decline. It's a bit counterintuitive. Progress doesn't erase graphite demand, it anchors it. Now layer in the scale problem. Global EV sales crossed 10 million units annually in recent years, depending on the data set you use. IEA figures sit slightly differently from Bloomberg NEF estimates, but the direction is consistent. Even under conservative forecasts, you're looking at tens of millions of vehicles per year by the end of the decade. Each one carries kilograms of graphite in its battery pack, not grams, kilograms. So even small percentage shifts in battery chemistry don't translate into meaningful reductions in absolute graphite demand. They just slow the growth curve slightly. This is where China's position becomes more than just industrial history. It becomes embedded in trajectory. Because while Western economies are still trying to build refining capacity, China's advantage is already moving downstream into next layers of battery production: anode manufacturing, cell assembly, recycling loops. Recycling is particularly important here. Spent graphite can be recovered and reprocessed, but that again depends on existing chemical processing infrastructure. And guess where most of that infrastructure already exists at scale? There's also a second-order effect that often gets missed in policy discussions. Battery manufacturers don't just buy graphite, they buy consistency, particle size distribution, surface area, impurity profiles. These aren't negotiable details. They directly affect battery life, charging speed, thermal stability. Once a supplier ecosystem proves it can deliver those specifications at massive scale, switching becomes less about price and more about risk management. That creates inertia. And inertia in supply chains is often stronger than formal dependency. Even if alternatives exist, procurement systems tend to optimize for predictability, not geopolitical diversification. This is why the "we can just reshore it" argument feels incomplete. Not wrong, just incomplete. Because reshoring assumes a static benchmark. But the benchmark keeps moving as incumbent systems improve efficiency, reduce cost, and tighten integration. There's a historical echo here, though it's not a perfect analogy. Think about Japan's dominance in high-purity chemical processing in the late 20th century. It wasn't just production volume. It was process control, consistency, and yield rates that competitors struggled to match for years. China's graphite position has some of that character, except scaled across a much larger industrial base. Now, I should acknowledge the counter-argument because it does matter. There are real efforts to diversify. Synthetic graphite production in North America is expanding. Europe is funding critical mineral independence programs, and some mining projects outside China are beginning to reach feasibility. Over time, that will reduce concentration. But the timeline matters more than the direction. If EV adoption accelerates faster than processing diversification, the system doesn't gradually rebalance. it hardens in its current configuration before alternatives are ready. And I don't think that timing question has been fully resolved in most strategic forecasts yet. So the uncomfortable possibility is this: even as countries invest heavily in future-proofing their supply chains, they may be locking themselves into today's dominant structure for longer than they expect, simply because demand is scaling faster than substitution capacity. The question then isn't whether China will dominate graphite forever. It won't. The question is whether the next decade of electrification is already being built on assumptions that only work if that dominance continues long enough to shape everything downstream. And that's where the uncertainty starts to matter more than the certainty dot. At this point, the debate usually gets simplified into a familiar framing. China has dominance, the West needs diversification, markets will eventually rebalance. It sounds clean on paper, almost comforting. But graphite doesn't sit comfortably inside that narrative anymore, because what we're really looking at is not a resource imbalance that can be corrected with investment cycles alone. It's a layered system where mining, chemistry, manufacturing standards, and timing are all entangled. And once those layers synchronize in one geography for long enough, they start to behave less like a market and more like an operating system. China's position in graphite isn't just about producing more. It's about defining what battery grade even means in practical industrial terms. When a majority of global anode material flows through one refining ecosystem, the tolerances, impurity thresholds, and cost structures gradually reflect that system's internal efficiencies. That kind of influence doesn't show up as formal control. It shows up as default behavior in procurement departments. Now, there's a temptation to view this as a permanent advantage. That would be wrong. Industrial advantages erode. They always do. Japan's precision manufacturing lead, America's semiconductor dominance in earlier decades, even OPEC's pricing power, all of these shifted when incentives and technology changed. But erosion takes time, and time is exactly what matters here. Western economies are not absent from this space. They're investing. The U.S. Department of Energy has funded multiple graphite anode projects. Canada and Australia are pushing integrated critical mineral strategies. Europe is experimenting with supply chain mandates tied to EV subsidies. The machinery of response is real. The issue is what happens in the meantime. Because EV adoption doesn't wait for supply chains to mature. Once vehicle platforms, battery contracts, and charging ecosystems scale, they create path dependence. Automakers don't redesign battery chemistry every time a new mine opens. They lock in suppliers years in advance, sometimes a decade. And that's where graphite becomes less about geology and more about timing asymmetry. If you map it bluntly, demand is compounding annually, while alternative refining capacity is scaling in multi-year political cycles. Those two curves don't intersect cleanly. I'm not entirely certain policymakers are pricing that mismatch correctly. The public narrative often treats diversification as a parallel track that will gradually reduce exposure. But industrial systems don't always behave gradually under stress. They tend to hold patterns until they abruptly don't. There's also a quieter strategic implication that doesn't get discussed much. If China maintains dominance in anode material processing, even partially into the next EV expansion phase, it doesn't just benefit from exports. It gains leverage over the pace of electrification itself, not through explicit restriction, but through capacity allocation, pricing stability, and contract prioritization during tight cycles. That's a very different kind of influence than commodity control in oil markets. It's subtler, less visible, harder to quantify until it shows up in delivery timelines. So where does this go? Best case scenario, diversification efforts succeed faster than expected. Synthetic graphite scales outside China, recycling loops mature, and the supply chain becomes genuinely multipolar within a decade. That's plausible, but it requires coordination across mining, chemical processing, and manufacturing that historically takes longer than political cycles are willing to admit. More likely scenario, partial diversification. Enough capacity is built to reduce extreme dependence, but China remains the marginal supplier that balances global demand. In that world, control isn't absolute, but it is structurally persistent. And then there's the less comfortable scenario that doesn't get stated directly in most reports. Even as countries reduce dependency on paper, the design choices in batteries, the economics of scale, and the inertia of existing supply contracts keep China at the center of the system longer than strategic documents assume. Not because alternatives fail, but because they arrive slightly out of phase with demand growth. I don't think this is a closed story. It's still unfolding. But if there's one takeaway I keep coming back to, it's this. Graphite is a reminder that energy transitions are not just about replacing fuels. They're about inheriting supply chain structures that don't reset when policy changes. And the real question isn't who has the most graphite. It's who controls the slow, expensive middle steps that turn raw material into something the modern economy actually runs on. That's where influence sits right now. And it doesn't look as visible as people expect. Before we wrap this, I'll leave you with one thought. If EV growth continues at current trajectories, and if processing capacity outside China scales slower than planned, then the defining constraint of electrification might not be lithium or oil or even chips. It might be something as unglamorous as whether the world can build enough of the right kind of carbon spheres fast enough in the right places. That's a strange place for leverage to hide, but supply chains rarely choose convenient hiding spots. If you want, next time we can go into who is actually trying to break this graphite bottleneck and why most of those attempts quietly struggle even after funding shows up.